Good to go.
All right, good evening. Welcome to the Vermilion Local School District Board of Education special meeting for Wednesday, May 10th, 2023. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Havermill.
Here.
Mrs. Innes.
Here.
Mrs. Russell.
Here.
Mrs. Stepp.
Here.
All members present.
Everybody please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Item 4, public participation on agenda items. Each participant is allowed 3 minutes to speak. Total time allotted for public participation is 30 minutes. Please register your name, address, topic, and group affiliation if applicable. All right. Item 5, treasurer's report and recommendations.
Thank you. Number 1, recommend a resolution to approve the May 2023 5-year forecast.
I'll move.
I'll second.
All right. You guys all have the presentation in front of you, but I'll just go through it real quickly. Again, the purpose of the 5-year forecast is really for 3 things. It's to engage the Board of Education and the community in long-range planning and discussions of financial issues facing the district. It's to serve as a basis for determining the school district's ability to sign contracts associated with continued operations or multi-year contracts. And lastly, is to provide a method for the Department of Education and the Auditor of State's Office to identify school districts with potential financial problems. Auditor's Office uses this particularly once they start within the next current fiscal year, 1 or 2 years out. If they're starting to project a deficit, they'll issue a performance audit, usually with those school districts or with cities. They use it a lot for that as well. Moving on to the revenue side, revenue really it's divided up into really 2 main categories: your local revenue and then your state revenue. First, we'll look at the local side. On the forecast, these are lines 1.010, 1.020, and 1.050. This is all your property taxes. Property taxes account for 80.6% of the district's revenue. Property values have been increasing an average of 1.3% between 2013 and 2018. However, the last 4 years, they're averaging 4.6% each year. So I have listed the percentages down there. The main year was our reappraisal year, which was a 9.1% increase, which happened in 2021. And then this year for 2022 is just a modest 0.3%. Property tax collections rates have historically been strong, and throughout this forecast, I anticipate them to continue. House Bill 920, though, prohibits tax collection to grow with residential property values. If you look back, our average revenue has actually decreased by 0.2% from 2012 through 2022. However, this year we did have a large delinquency payments made by the public utility companies, which increased our revenue significantly by 6.5% compared to last year. The historical property values on the next page, this is just showing you the effects of House Bill 920. As I said, from 2012 through 2022, we've actually decreased in revenue by 0.2%. But as you can see here, starting in 2013 all the way through 2022, we've had over $120 million in increased valuation. And that is what House Bill 920 is designed to do, to keep your revenue flat while your property taxes grow, while your property values grow. And then the next page here, it's the historical property tax collections. Again, as I mentioned, we did have a large delinquency payment by our public utility, which is why we're so much higher this year than the previous years. But again, throughout that 2013 through 2022, you can see our revenues. They really haven't gone up or down significantly in either way. Moving on to the state side of things, state revenue accounts for 18% of our property, of our district's revenue. Beginning in fiscal year 2022, Ohio adopted the Fair School Funding Plan. This plan seeks to base the state's per pupil amount on actual expenses faced by a district rather than a residual budgeting approach, which has always been done in the past. Under this plan, the state's share of the calculated base costs equal just under $1,200 per pupil for Vermilion students. And just to give you a comparison, last fiscal year, basically, the average per pupil expenditure in the state of Ohio, it was $14,215, and in Erie County, it was $14,088. So again, the state is funding us $1,200 per student, even though the average cost is $14,000 to educate. Moving down again on the next page, I've just given you a breakdown of our enrollment and our revenue, percent change, dollar change. But one thing to keep in mind with this, starting in 2022, the student wellness and success funds that typically were outside of the forecast that Governor DeWine initiated, they've now included them. Back in 2021, that amount was $300,000 that was outside of the forecast, so it wouldn't show up here or in our state funding. As you can see, the new Fair School Funding Plan absorbed that, even though we don't have an increase of $300,000 from year to year. Moving on to our property tax allocation. Property tax allocation, it's about 6.5% of the district's revenue. This is the part of your tax bill that the state pays. This is the 10% rollback and the 2.5% owner occupied. And then there's an additional homestead credit for qualifying taxpayers. Approximately 11.6% of local residents' property taxes are paid by the state of Ohio in the form of rollback and 2.4% in the homestead. So again, this is the state's portion. When you look at your tax bill, you see all those deductions on the top of it. That's this right here, this rollback. This always stays pretty consistent. They had some clawbacks back in the early 2010, 2011, 2012. You can see we've decreased in revenue a little bit. But for the most part, last 5 years, it's been fairly consistent. Always seems to be right around that $1.6 million. Lastly, that's, we've covered state, we've covered local, now it's just everything else that goes in between there. All of the revenues, they account for 4.2% of the district's revenue. This is your transportation, this is the interest that we earn on our investments, payments in lieu of taxes, Medicaid reimbursements. This line item is estimated to drop the next year and then remain flat over the course of the forecasted period. The drop is really due to the open enrollment funding, again, the Fair School Funding Plan, no longer going to the district of residents in the form of other revenue. So not only did they drop the revenue on the open enrollment side, they also dropped the expenditures, which would fall under purchase services at the expenditure side of this forecast. So moving on to the next page, just looking quickly at the historical and forecasted revenue. In the blue there are actuals, and everything in red is estimates still, even though fiscal year 23 we're pretty close with only a month and a half left here until we hit July, but it's still an estimated forecast at this point. And again, our revenue, for the most part, ebbs and flows a little bit. We're seeing a little bit more on the public utility property. They're getting valued more, and that's why we're seeing that increase. Moving on to the expenditure side, we'll look at salaries. Largest, this is almost 55% of our total expenditures. This consists of salaries, wages, including extended time, severance pay, supplemental contracts, and overtime. One thing to note here, personnel services have been offset by a recoding of the general fund salaries to federal funds last year. However, moving forward, we're not able to do that. So salaries are anticipated to increase an average of 1.5% in the forecasted year. Looking at the historical and forecasted personnel services, you can see last year we had $10.1 million in salaries, and this year we jumped up to 14.4. We didn't go on a big hiring spree. We didn't really affect staffing that much one way or another. It's just the way I have to show it. I can no longer code those to federal funds, which were off the forecast before, and now they're included, and they always will be. So those costs that you see there now, I'm unable to do anything with it as far as using a different form of funding other than the general fund now. Moving on to benefits, 19.4% of the budget, and it's forecasted to increase over the next 5 years. Again, this is your retirements for all employees. This is workers' compensation. This is early retirement, Medicare, unemployment, board paid portion. This isn't just health insurance. And again, we're estimating an annual increase of 2.4% each year. Down below, you can see the actuals in blue. They do ebb and flow a little bit. But starting in 2023, we just have a consistent 2.4% increase each year. Moving on to purchase services, these account for 15.3% of our expenditures. This is tuition paid to external providers, this is utilities, this is services performed by outside vendors. Again, as I made mention before, on the revenue side for the Fair School Funding Plan, the Fair School Funding Plan has eliminated the expenditures related to open enrollment in community schools, which would normally hit this one. Any future improvements to the district's buildings and grounds will be from this line. And because we do not have a dedicated funding source, such as a permanent improvement or a bond levy, the general fund must pay for these. Again, down below, there's the historical and the actuals and the forecast. Moving on to line 6.010, revenues over expenditures. It just gives you a good sense of the district's fiscal health. Positive number indicates that a school district spent what its revenue for that fiscal year. A negative number indicates the school district spent or is trending to spend more revenue than it brings in for the year. Typically, a forecast has estimated a negative number, again, just because the forecast is showing a trend, and it does not include future changes or adjustments to that trend. I graphed that trend out on the next page there. You can see the large increase from 2022 to 2023. Again, that's because a lot of the salaries that used to be able to go to federal funds can no longer be there. What does that all mean? Well, here's a roll-up or a snapshot, if you will, of the forecast. Forecasted for 2023 is a deficit spend of $1.3 million. And you can follow the trend across that results of operation line. At this point, you know, it's been a long time since we have asked the taxpayers for new money. Every levy has a life cycle to it, basically. And right now we're at the top of that. And we'll see how much longer we can push that out, obviously. Final comments, the district will need to invest in its infrastructure and components as components age. Without having a dedicated funding source for replacement, the general fund will be tasked with paying for these replacements. Also, the district will need to keep an eye on staffing levels, particularly in years 2024 and beyond, as our expenditures continue to climb. Despite accumulating costs, the district is in good financial standing from a cash balance standpoint and will continue to do so throughout the forecast. And then another little bullet point at the bottom here, out of the 611 school districts in Ohio, 518 have a permanent improvement levy, and 432 of them have a bond levy. The number of school districts in Ohio that operate without a bond or without a permanent improvement levy is 56 schools, and Vermilion is one of them. Any questions?
Thank you.
Good, thank you.
That's pretty impressive, actually.
All right, call the roll, please.
Mr. Habermill,
Yes.
Mrs. Ennis,
Yes.
Mrs. Russell,
Yes.
Mrs. Stepp.
Yes.
Motion approved 4-0.
Item 6, public participation. Public participation section of the Board of Education's agenda is specifically designed for the public to address the board with compliments, concerns, ideas, and/or questions. The board welcomes your comments. If you wish to address the board regarding a problem, the board would remind you of two things. First, your comments should be factual and respectful to the rights of others. Second, before coming to the board with a specific problem, you should have first addressed the problem with the appropriate teacher, staff member, or administrator. This meeting of the Board of Education is in public is for the purpose of conducting school district business. Anyone like to speak? All right. Item 7, adjournment into executive session. Recommend a resolution for the board to move into executive session for the purpose of interviewing candidates for the vacancy on the school board.
I'll move. I'll second.
Call the roll, please.
Mr. Habermill,
Yes.
Mrs. Ennis.
Yes.
Mrs. Russell,
Yes.
Mrs. Stepp.
Yes.
Motion approved 4-0, and the time is 5:14 p.m.
Okay, return from executive session at 8:08 p.m. Item 8, motion to adjourn.
I'll move.
I'll second.
Call the roll, please.
Mr. Habermill,
Yes.
Ms. Ennis,
Yes.
Ms. Russell,
Yes.
Ms. Stepp.
Yes.
Motion approved 4-0, and the time is 8:10 p.m.